in the Bitcoin world or in a Bitcoin startup, you can basically do whatever the fuck you want. We had someone from Africa on who literally survived because of Bitcoin. Whatever happened in the US the last 4 years now is absolutely miserable.
Welcome, everyone, to the Proof of Words podcast. I'm here with my good buddy, Joel. Joel, did you know that how I kind of prepped for having you on my podcast today? I actually earlier today went back and listened to our recording that we did, I think, last year on your Bitcoin rabbit stories or rabbit hole stories, how people get into Bitcoin. I'm sorry, that is still absolutely one of the most fun podcasts I think I've ever recorded with anybody. It was an absolute blast and a privilege to be on that show with you, sir.
Yeah, I think I had to cut some bits because we definitely said some not so PG-friendly stuff on there. But hey, it turned out great.
Trust me when I say I've gotten in trouble from shareholders of Samara for some of the stuff that I say publicly anyway. I don't know. It's difficult running a European public company. And having to kind of walk a fine line where I do kind of try to stay out of politics. Like, obviously, professionally, I think that's only proper for anybody to do professionally. But at the same time, politicians have started targeting my industry. It's almost like hard to not be political to a certain extent. I mean, as of the day that we're recording this, we recently just saw John Deaton absolutely shit all over Elizabeth Warren's face in a debate. Did you see that just yesterday?
I just see the clips, but yeah, it made the rounds on X or social media, wherever it was.
That was absolutely wild. So it's interesting. You got to kind of walk that fine line. So I do appreciate you taking out some of that content. But if you want to send me some of those clips, I would love to take a gander through that once more. So how has the podcast been going? Have you guys been able to grow it?
You know, it's still one of these side things where we went like, well, I guess, I mean, how the podcast came about was we were pissed drunk after a meetup in London. And, you know, when you're drunk, you have brilliant ideas, as I'm sure you're aware of as well, from what I've heard with like the Bitcoin magazine events and stuff you put on. And we went kind of like, well, let's do a podcast. And then it just kept going.
Usually when I'm drinking, that's when I go and smash buy some more Bitcoin. So those are always the best ideas, right? Yeah.
And I mean, you know, it came about a good friendship formed with my co-host, Ian. And we had some cool guests on. We got to hear the inside scoop. And you really get to talk to everyone and just not like the hardcore maxi pats and social media. So that's good.
I mean, I always say, like, I have an unbelievably busy schedule, as you can imagine. And I get to meet a lot of great founders with what I do. I get to meet a lot of great asset managers with what I do, some of the world's smartest people, and certainly some of our industry's smartest people. But I actually learn more when I conduct interviews doing these podcasts than I ever do in my actual day job. It's wild. I mean, some of the knowledge that you get imparted on just by sitting down and having these conversations is wild. I mean, like, what's like maybe the most interesting fact that you've learned just through your own podcast?
So we had, we did the recording now. It's not out yet. We also had a alternative asset manager on from Switzerland and also heavily into the Bitcoin ecosystem, and obviously also has some funds where they have certain crypto alpha strategies. Mm-hmm. And it's just like whatever you guys have to do in like the TradFi world, where in the Bitcoin world or in a Bitcoin startup, you can basically do whatever the fuck you want. Obviously, you have to stay a bit inside the guidelines of regulation, but they're very lean. And he explained to me that he literally had a comma misplaced in like one of his updates, and that got them in trouble. I was like, what the fuck? If you have to be as careful with the wording, which we have to be anyway these days, right? With like fucking political correctness and stuff. But if it's just down to a comma or a certain word or hinting at like this may or may not happen, and this has a huge impact for your business, it's essentially like the career of your employees and stuff. That was quite crazy. And then we had someone from Africa on who literally survived because of Bitcoin, like not low key, but survived because she was able to flee. And that was kind of like, okay, I guess that's sort of the Western privilege we have a bit over here, because to us, it's just like pure speculation. We get the story.
I mean, that sounds like a hell of a story.
Yeah, it was, I mean, it's one of these, I can't remember which country it was anymore, but, where if you're a woman, you get either slaughtered, raped, or you're lucky enough and get out without any harm. Luckily, she was the latter one. And yeah, she didn't have to like store up her entire suitcase, with money or stuff or gold or whatever. She just had to remember the 12 words, and that was it. So that was crazy. Like, you never experienced that in the real world over here.
I mean, yeah, we are awfully privileged. We are awfully privileged when it comes to that. It's a bit crazy. So I wanted to ask you. So, I mean, you've been hardcore at work over the last year, ever since we last chatted, on the Relai app. Tell us a little bit about what that is. You guys are doing basically a custodial platform exclusively focusing on Bitcoin. Can you tell us a bit more about what it is that you guys have, where it's based, etc.?
Sure. So I could not give the my day job answer with like the press answer. Or I could give a heartfelt answer, which is going to be the second
heartfelt
one.
Answer, please.
So we're a Bitcoin broker, essentially. The only difference to us, if you think about like River or Swan, if they're still around, is that you don't actually have to custody with us. We come with an integrated self-custody wallet, which is good if you think about holding your own keys and holding your own proper Bitcoin. But also comes with downsides, obviously, as to users just losing the keys and basically using the money they have in there. We're Swiss-based, so we're right in the center of currently still easy regulation, but that's also subject to change. And our idea was like, well, all the American companies are basically doing the Bitcoin stuff over there. We'll do the same thing, just with our European perspective and obviously with the different markets that you can approach over here. As to, you don't have the same language. You have different environments, different economies and stuff. So that's what we basically do. If you download the app and you now have to do KYC, thank you, Lagarde. It's a fucked up process. You can then basically buy Bitcoin within a minute if you use direct debit cards, and let's say 2 business days if you do a bank transfer. And that's it. You could do savings plans. You could do smash buys. You can also sell if you want to, or if you want to buy in larger amounts. And as a business, we also have an OTC desk and the business offering.
Why would anybody ever use your app to sell Bitcoin? I mean, you shouldn't even have that feature on there.
We made a joke of like, if you click on sell, you would get the meme of Sailor where it goes for like 10 hours and it says there is no second best. But obviously, again, with the whole regulation, it was like, well, if you're a broker and you got the brokerage license, you also have to have the sell option. So you kind of have to do this. But I think last time I checked a month ago, only 8% of our user base has actually ever sold. So there's a lot of accumulation, moving it to their own wallets. Or some of them just leave it in the Relai wallet, because if they don't want to use us, they can import the seed elsewhere and, happy days, move on.
So are you planning on expanding the scope of this, as far as like, usability perspective to like payments and remittances? Like, so for instance, obviously people never want to sell their Bitcoin, but I mean, I would love to live in a world where I actually get to use my Bitcoin, for the purchases of goods and services. And a lot of people say like, well, how is that different than selling? I don't necessarily look at using Bitcoin as selling Bitcoin. Like if I were to go and take one Bitcoin and liquidate it for, I don't know, whatever, $67,000, what it's worth today. Yeah, that's selling it. But if I go and I use, I don't know, 200 Satoshis to buy a coffee, I mean, philosophically.
Where are you buying coffee for 200 sats? You got to give me the name of that place.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe like 200,000 sats, right? Is probably the more accurate number, right? But philosophically, do you view that as selling Bitcoin, or is that using Bitcoin?
No, it's using Bitcoin. I mean, me personally, I've also been, so before joining Relai, I used to be a freelancer for 10 years. Before that, a journalist, but also freelancer, and then just moved into more of like content advisory and stuff. And I also got paid from like American clients, Central American clients. Even I had a client once in Argentina. I got paid in Bitcoin. So it was just the currency to use. It made sense. I got paid within 10 minutes. And I also had to liquidate that stuff, or I was able to pay for services in Bitcoin. So it's not selling to me. It doesn't go back into the fiat Ponzi. It keeps staying in the Bitcoin ecosystem. Whether certain people see this as selling, I don't really give a shit. It's there to be used. So yeah, that's what you can also do in the Relai wallet. We have enabled the Lightning Network. It's a bit wonky at times, but it works about half of the time for our user base. We still have some bugs to iron out because, Lightning is an ongoing struggle if you want to keep development up to a high standard, let's say.
I mean, I used to run a Lightning node, like maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago. I no longer, I mean, it was in the States. I spend most of my time in Europe the last couple of months. So I just haven't been doing any upkeep with it or anything along those lines. But for me, it's just so, like, Lightning is just so too abstract right now for most users to actually engage with. I mean, it was a goddamn, like, I'm not a technologist by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm at least familiar with the technology. Like, am I going to be able to sit down and code something? No. Can I sit down and set up my own node? It's taken me a couple of months to figure out how to do so, but yeah, I was able to get it done, right? I just don't see how the way that Lightning is currently structured, we're going to be able to onboard the next generation of users seamlessly unless somebody comes up with a significantly or easier path to engaging with and working with the Lightning Network. I mean, so what is it that you guys have been able to build, or what is it that you would like to ideally build so that users can better engage with the Lightning Network and have more scalable remittances using Bitcoin?
Sure. So the number one thing is obviously, could be a bit technical now, but the whole routing thing so that you can actually get the payment done quickly and easily. Currently, it's just taking a bit longer because we are self-custodial, so it has to find its own way. It's not set. Then we go into, addresses. It's sort of, think of it like an email address. You have username at relay.app or something, and you can just share this with friends. We're also thinking of what River does with the whole, social sharing, where you can basically send it via text message or something, and then just people can request and send Bitcoin. And then in the future, we're also thinking about setting up POS systems, or just the ability to pay with like NFC or all of these fidgy gadgets you have in the Lightning space. So there's definitely stuff in the works. Currently, it's just, the foundation has to be solid enough to be used, which is not where it's at currently. But at least with the next couple of sprints, what I've seen and tested, it looks quite solid. So we can go from there.
No, that's fantastic. So when do you expect that something like that's going to be able to be rolled out? You said that there's a couple of sprints that you guys are working through. Is this something that we could expect to be imminent? Is it something for 2025?
It's more probably end of Q1 25. We first of all, we get a French license now in December, where we can then also, actively market the whole Europe. It's again regulation. Like, we're Swiss based, but we're not allowed to market actively in other European countries. Otherwise, you get letters from like BaFin or whoever. And then once we get that, we'll turn it into the MiCA license, which obviously will help. Again, with its downsides, with certain things. And then from there on out, it's basically the product is solid enough that you can then start building these additional services. There's also some cool stuff planned in the, multi-sig version of things, maybe inheritance, maybe these kind of things. So there's a lot of stuff going on. But yeah, it just takes time because, let's say the Bitcoin network is not the fastest to adopt and build, but that's sometimes good. You got to take your time and you get the foundation solid enough to then grow from there.
So one of the things that your app is famous for is that you guys are exclusively focused on Bitcoin. And a lot of other crypto applications, they don't take that approach. I mean, God, just look at all the exchanges. Every single one has every shitcoin on there. And some of them even charge millions of dollars for listing of some of the shitcoins, right? I mean, it's crazy what Binance and some of the others are able to get away with. Maybe not so much nowadays as historically, but still the precedent's there. The two questions I would have for you are, number one, why is it that you're exclusively focusing on Bitcoin? And is that a part of a long-term strategy where you see Bitcoin being the only truly viable crypto asset, the only truly viable cryptocurrency? And number two, by focusing exclusively on Bitcoin, are you leaving a lot of opportunity on the table? Or do you think the opportunity cost of servicing other coins today, the short-term revenue or the short-term user adoption you might see from that, comes at the opportunity cost of a larger business over the medium and longer term, exclusively tied around Bitcoin?
So I'm going to start the answering of the question with the second one. Short term, sure, you leave money on the table. Just think about, you've mentioned Binance, but you can basically take any crypto exchange. I think it's safe to say if they want to make money real quick, it's easy to just list whatever low market cap token, basically buy 70% of that share, do the marketing hype, pump it up. People will buy into it, do stuff like referral programs, cash out, and then leave the project burned. So there's certainly business opportunities there, let's call it. But the whole thing that the market evolved, also our two co-founders, they've been hardcore Bitcoin on one end with Julian, our CEO, and Adam was more sort of the tech guy, blockchain developer. But they quickly realized the biggest interest they had early on from investors was to be Bitcoin only, because there was never a trusted address where you could go to, where you just solely focus on Bitcoin and have an optimized process. So that's why we basically went down the Bitcoin only way. And then the second path was just, well, should we offer all of these other coins? What does it actually take? And just from a tech standpoint, because we are self-custodial, it would have been such a workload where roughly 70% of your company would be in the product team and in the tech team to just keep the app alive, because it is self-custodial. It's not custodian. It's not basically a spreadsheet and the front end like the exchanges. So we committed to staying Bitcoin only also in the long run and really be the Bitcoin only address in Europe where people go to, and they don't have to fuss about with all of the marketing gags you see on Coinbase, Kraken, or all other companies, which are, by the way, also doing a fantastic job. If these guys wouldn't exist, we wouldn't be here where we are today. Literally with Coinbase, like if they wouldn't exist, the ETFs, like what is it? 80% of them wouldn't have a custodian. They would have to have something else. So there is a bit of that in there. We wouldn't rule out maybe listing or allowing stable coins in the future because it is, again, with that remittance thing, a play where you can build on. But just like you have gold-only brokers, for example, we tend to be a Bitcoin-only broker. Whether that means that in the next 20 years we leave some money on the table, who knows? But if you look at all of the shit that's out there and you combine it to Bitcoin, or you compare it rather, you see that measured in Bitcoin, everything is going down. So I think it's safe to say currently we're doing the best play and betting on the right horse.
I mean, I certainly think that I would agree with that. I mean, as I've stated before, I'm not necessarily a maximalist by any stretch of the imagination. Being the libertarian that I am, like Bitcoin is the only thing that Bitcoin is the only thing that I find value in, but that doesn't mean that I'm going to shun anybody else for finding values in others. It's just interesting that from a fiduciary perspective, your company is taking the approach of exclusively focusing on Bitcoin, because it's slightly different than, for instance, my company, Samara, we're an investor in Bitcoin, right? We hold Bitcoin on our balance sheet as our primary treasury reserve asset, just because we have a fundamental belief over the medium and long term, everything will go to zero against Bitcoin. And historically speaking, I do believe that that's true. And Bitcoin's barely existed for more than a decade already. But we don't offer services that we could generate revenue from. So for instance, by offering Ethereum brokerage, and other, or Solana brokerage, assets like that, or shitcoin brokerage. I don't know. It's just very unique, I think, to see a company that is building products and services to exclusively own in on Bitcoin and Bitcoin alone. That must take an awful lot of discipline.
It definitely does. I mean, we also have some developers who are more like chain agnostic. You know, they also look at other stuff. And like, don't get me wrong, I also see the use case in all of the other cryptos that exist. For example, the whole smart contract thing. Does that work on Bitcoin? Theoretically, yes, speaking, but it wouldn't make sense. So you do have that use case for Ethereum, for example. If you want to have the meme coins and the NFT hype and stuff, you have Solana. Or how I like to call it, anal OS, if you spell it backwards, if it doesn't go down. And, you have stable coins and they just don't run on Bitcoin. And there's a reason for that. And you shouldn't put that down in a sense. But for us, if you look at it from a store of value principle, it definitely makes sense to be in Bitcoin only. And we're happy to be that. But who knows what might change with, you know, scaling solutions in the future. Maybe there is a future where you can have stable coins in Bitcoin or Lightning or whatever. That's definitely something we would then also further approach, because that again feeds into the whole philosophy of you can actually use Bitcoin in whatever way you want it.
So what is your view on some of the layer 2 solutions that are out there? Because for instance, you speak to some Bitcoiners, and I mean, a couple of them I've had conversations with, and these are some of the like the real OGs, and they're not the biggest fan of the idea of many of these layer 2 solutions making Bitcoin more scalable from a payments perspective, nor are they happy with the idea of these layer 2s creating tokenized contracts or allowing for NFTs on Bitcoin, because for them, Bitcoin can and only ever should be the peer-to-peer e-money. It should only ever be that censorship-resistant digital gold e-cash that Satoshi theorized and put into basically willed into existence, right? With help from the community, obviously. Others look at this, and I think they're more aligned with your view. Well, yeah, it's great that Bitcoin exists according to Satoshi's vision today, but maybe just because technology was limited 15 years ago, or maybe because Satoshi just didn't have the foresight to see what cryptography could one day enable as new technology does develop, what Bitcoin could one day potentially become. So where do you kind of fall on that thing?
So I don't personally have an issue with the whole layer 2 things or even the ordinals things. I remember when it came out, I was like, well, it's not the first time we have NFTs on Bitcoin. So I got into Bitcoin in 2011, took it seriously in 2016. And there have always been these things going on. So it's always been part of the whole ecosystem. And if you have something that is being utilized as a store of value or potentially medium of exchange, that value or exchange can be two totally different things. It could be the money or the fiat denominated price that you actually buy and sell Bitcoin for or you trade it for. Or it could be something like you import art or an important message onto the blockchain and you use it this way. So I think it's down to personal preference. I don't really see the use case of having, I don't know, butt dicks or whatever it's called on Bitcoin. Like I'm not personal fan.
Crypto dick butts, I think, was getting shilled a while back.
Yeah, something like that. But it does show that you can actually also do something with Bitcoin. So that's the interesting thing for me. And with the whole scaling solutions, like, you know, this is a bit down to the maxi community again. Like a lot of them claim to be libertarian, but then they only want to push one viewpoint of the world. And then on the other hand, you have other scaling solutions that are being accepted. But if someone comes up with their own version of things and it's maybe cross-chain functional with like an EVM and stuff, that's certainly bad. So I think there's a high threshold there of certain hypocrisy. But if it helps bringing more people in, who are we to judge? And a lot of my friends who are like into NFTs, they basically came over from Ethereum. They said, fuck that. Fuck the high gas fees. I'll come over to Bitcoin. And to get an NFT onto Bitcoin and an ordinals in the early days, you had to know about UTXO management. You had to run your own node back then. So they really became hardcore Bitcoiners, but with a different approach to the whole thing. So if that gets us to mass adoption, I'm super happy with that. Same with the ETFs, by the way. It was inevitable that, you know, that adoption wave would come, and look at what that has brought us. So if you want to stay a purist and only use it as peer-to-peer, be my guest. But I guess it's healthy to adapt to the modern times and see how the asset is being used in those times.
And this is where I've become, if I'm being completely honest, a bit disillusioned with a lot of the more traditionalist Bitcoin maximalist OGs. And there's absolutely plenty of them. And like, for instance, while I don't necessarily disagree with their position that it should be Bitcoin and Bitcoin only, it becomes so toxic when you start shitting on anybody else for their preference to use anything else. And this is where you kind of hit the nail on the head perfectly here. Like a lot of these individuals believe in Bitcoin. For instance, I believe in Bitcoin because of my libertarian ideology, right? But for me, a fundamental piece of libertarianism is it's not my prerogative to dictate to or to judge another person if they have a different preference. As long as they don't infringe my rights to have my own preference, which is Bitcoin and Bitcoin alone, I just don't understand why people don't have that type of mentality. I mean, but then you start to understand there's a whole bunch of different types of libertarians, and many libertarians are awfully authoritarian.
I find it almost ironic sometimes if I see these posts online, and it's always the type of guy who believes with like his 0.1% Bitcoin, with his 0.1 Bitcoin, he's going to be super rich one day, which like, bro, that's not going to happen. Let's be realistic here. I bet none of them have actually read upon anything that has to do with libertarianism, or they actually probably never read a book about the matter, or really thought about this principle of like, hey, at the end of the day, if everyone plays according to the rules the network provides, like even the ETF issuers, the only thing they know is the TradFi world. So logically, you build products that reflect that world, but also drive upon the innovation you have with Bitcoin. And if that means that you have the ETFs, great. ETFs investors with the huge capital allocation have now the possibility to join the ecosystem. And who knows, maybe some of them go like, well, I own like, I don't know, 50% of my Bitcoin stack in the ETFs and another 25 maybe with like a Bitcoin only broker. If you're in Europe, you know where to reach out. And the rest, they maybe gamble a bit on the NFTs or they do any other stuff in crypto. Like, again, who are we to judge? But as long as they come in, I'm more than happy to have them here. And then we'll see how this whole thing evolves.
I feel like this is a fundamental flaw that many in Bitcoin and crypto, and granted, I will say, when I say many, I do mean I think it's a small minority of us.
That just allows us.
Yeah, they think that Bitcoin and crypto should just stand alone on the side. They don't necessarily care too much about the price going up. Of course, they want the price to go up, but they just want it to exist as this kind of cypherpunk pseudo mentality, just off on the side on its own. Give zero fucks about regulation, zero fucks about compliance, zero fucks about TradFi. Just be on the side and not worry about anything that is a part of traditional markets at all. And you know what? Okay, there could be an argument for that. But at the end of the day, if we want to see mass adoption, we're not going to see it by having Bitcoin and crypto exist as it did 5 to 10 years ago, when it really was only accessible by the purists, right? Like, we cannot go back to the point where it's pure Bitcoin anymore, or else we'd have the Bitcoin faucet. We would have localbitcoins.com still, right? You would have all of these other ways that are completely non-compliant. But their argument is that we should just ignore compliance, regulation, the user journeys that the mainstream and retail masses prefer, for the sake of like really more to just kind of spite ourselves, right? It almost feels reductive. It feels redundant. And I just don't necessarily understand that mentality, because it leaves so much opportunity on the table, because the ETFs obviously have brought in billions and billions of purchasing power into Bitcoin. And while the Ethereum launch didn't go anywhere near as well as the Bitcoin launch did, I mean, the Ethereum ETFs have a few billion in them as well. Kudos to that.
It's probably Joe Lubin and his friends stacking up, but that's a different topic.
It might be. I mean, I know a lot of the other issuers, like they have a whole bunch of coins lined up, like Litecoin's getting lined up apparently for an ETF.
Yeah, XRP and that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And God knows Chris Larson or Garlinghouse, Ripple itself are the ones that are going to be the only goddamn investors in the XRP ETF, right? At least I would hope that they are, because God help anybody that puts money into XRP. It just disturbs me to see that a lot of the toxicity of Bitcoin and crypto that we have amongst ourselves within these different communities is now leaking over to the mainstream, because that does nothing but harm us in the long term. And I mean, you're a journalist. How would you go about changing that mentality, A, within Bitcoin and crypto, and B, how would you change the messaging to make it seem like we are not these toxic little gremlins, toxic little degenerates that are difficult to work with and are just trying to skate along the lines of it being criminals and money laundering? Because, I mean, that's what a lot of mainstream politicians allege us to be.
Sure. So I think what we have to use or do better is use the success of the ETFs. So for example, in my day today, if I speak to roughly around 5 to like 25 journalists each day, because A, you're always pitching, especially if you're a startup, and B, just because I know a lot of the guys from back in the days. And without a doubt, the number one question is always regarding the ETF. So if I were to be toxic and I would sort of downplay it and go like, I don't know, fuck Larry Fink, he doesn't know what he thinks about. If anyone from BlackRock is listening, I'm not thinking this, I'm just quoting here. Please don't kill me. You would never actually get going with a conversation. It would always be an instant blocker. So that's usually the lead I use to basically explain how successful the ETFs are. And I mean, it's the best example. Larry Fink, and I actually interviewed him in 2018. He was a huge skeptic of everything.
Bitcoin.
The funny thing was, like, I interviewed him and like my editor was like, whatever you do, if you're asking about Bitcoin, you're going to quit on the spot. I was like, sure. So, you know, the last question in the round was like, he was very open, very, very friendly and stuff. And, he was also quite open to the idea that like a 22-year-old interviews him. And he went like, do you have any questions? And I kind of went, what do you think about Bitcoin? And, this was in the days when he was like, it's money for criminals and stuff. But he gave a very well thought out, you know, dad answer. Like, I think you need to mature a bit and like see the investments we have with iShares and stuff as a more serious note. But we turned him from being a skeptic he's on national TV basically now proclaiming that it's a safe haven, that you should use it as a store of value. Obviously also with his own sales advantage probably and the way he can then sell his shares. But if you can use that success to then pitch the story and the ideas behind Bitcoin, that is obviously a big help. And in my opinion, a lot of Bitcoiners don't like to play into the whole number go up thing. Why it goes up. It's just like, oh, we don't care. One Bitcoin is one Bitcoin. We should stop doing that shit. If Bitcoin trades from 30K a year ago to now 70K or whatever, or whatever the number will be in the future when this podcast comes out, this is actually something good that you should explain to people why it gains in value. And you can then use these opportunities to draw the contrast between the current system, what Bitcoin tries to solve, what are still the issues with Bitcoin. So just being open, transparent, and also self-critical about stuff has led me to a lot of success with the journals. Whether they then achieve to actually pitch the story internally and not have a like left-wing crazy editor at the top of the board who approves or disapproves of the message, that's a different thing. But the more we can use these sort of zeitgeist events and then move over and explain the benefits, the better it will become. And this also means, and I know trigger word for any maxis listening, as a Bitcoin company, you have to then go to crypto native events like, I don't know, Paris Blockchain Week, Consensus, or all of these events, or even go to these events hosted by the ETF issuers and start speaking to them. Because if you actually do, you realize they're more bullish on the whole thing than you probably are. And they just use a different outlet to express that bullishness. So the more we do that, the better.
So I went to Consensus for a day just this past year. I mean, I used to go years and years ago. I fell into the trap of, okay, I'm going to avoid crypto conferences. I'm just going to go to the Bitcoin conferences. But to be fair, I mean, I started going more to the asset management and the finance conferences, right? Just because I run a public company and I run an asset management group. I have to, right? I can only go to so many conferences a year.
Do you wear a suit if you go to the conference? Do you have to, or can you basically show up the way you want to?
You know, the only place that I ever really wear a suit whenever I go to a conference is in Dubai or the UAE, just because there you really have to present, like anywhere in the West, in Europe, or even in the United States, okay, I'll wear something a little bit nicer. Like maybe I'll wear a button down or like a polo shirt and nice pair of slacks or a nice pair of jeans, right? But you can't do that in Dubai. Like if you're going to like the degenerate Bitcoin crypto conferences, like sure, wear whatever the hell you want. Nobody cares. But if you're going to be meeting with a sheikh or you're meeting with real proper businessmen there, you suit up and you just try to look your best as the dutiful colonizer coming from the West, right? No, but anyways, so one of the things I did want to kind of own off of what you were going on there. I mean, one of the kind of changes for me mentally over the last 2 years or so, because as you know, I used to have a company, was an asset manager. We built some of the first Bitcoin ETPs on earth, right? And now running Samara Asset Group, which again, still a bit of an asset manager. It's really more just a balance sheet. We invest in portfolio companies, Bitcoin, et cetera. Bitcoin's our treasury reserve asset. My understanding of Bitcoin, which I've always kind of known was money, and that's how I've always pitched it. It is the world's most perfect form of money. It's the world's hardest form of money. But it's never really been money until very recently for me. And how that's changed is, so you said we should be going to these conferences. We should be talking about number going up, even though historically we've never liked doing that. I've kind of flipped a little bit, because whenever you talk about number going up relative to fiat, it's always then viewed as an investment. Oh yeah, you buy Bitcoin because the value of the Bitcoin is going to go up relative to the dollar. That's changed for me over the last 12 to 18 months. Anytime anybody comes to me and says like, well, why are you in Bitcoin? I'm now, and I see, I mean, he's an absolute nutcase. I love the guy, but he's absolutely off the wall. But like Max Kaiser, he's been pitching Bitcoin, I think, the right way from the beginning. Everything is going to zero against Bitcoin. That's the way that we need to be pitching this, that the natural state of a monetary system should be deflationary. And while Bitcoin technically isn't deflationary, it's disinflationary. Because it has sound mechanics, it has a good monetary governance system, it will always appreciate relative to other assets, not because it's actually going up in value. 1 Bitcoin is equal to 1 Bitcoin, rather because every other asset is going down relative to it. And when you start thinking about it in that framework, and I think even Anthony Pompliano, he just said earlier this week, and I was watching his interview. I forget if it was on CSNBC or Fox or wherever he was doing the interview. But he made the point to his interviewer that, well, did you know that the housing costs in the United States are down 98%? And I looked at that and I was just like, okay, I don't know what Pomp's been smoking. I don't know if being a father has driven him crazy and he's just completely lost his mind. But like, no, I mean, my wife and I, we've been looking to buy a house in the United States over the last couple of months. We've been thinking about it. Mortgage rates are through the roof. Even with the Fed pulling back on rates, mortgage rates haven't fallen. They've actually gone up, which is mind-blowing, to be completely honest. And the cost of rent, the cost of housing has skyrocketed over the last 5 years. So how the hell can you, Anthony Pompliano, say that over the last decade, the cost of housing has gone down 98%? Well, it's because he's pricing it in Bitcoin.
Bitcoin, yeah.
Yeah. So he looked at it and said, well, actually, about 8 years ago, it would cost you 98 Bitcoin, or I think it was roughly 98, 99 Bitcoin, to buy a house in the United States. The average cost of a house in the United States would have been 98 Bitcoin. Today, it's less than 2 Bitcoin to get a down payment onto a house. That is astounding to think about it like that. But that's the type of mentality I think people have to have. That's the type of mentality that we have to have as we pitch Bitcoin. No, it is not an investment that appreciates versus the dollar. Yes, it is a currency that holds its value, stores its value, while everything else goes to zero against it. And I think if you start having that mentality, and I know it sounds a bit extreme and it's quite the inverse, that's kind of where I think people understand it a little bit more because they start to view it as money rather than as an investment.
Yeah, to be frank, I did try this a lot in spring, early summer, and with journals and also some partnerships we were pitching with like traditional fintechs and TradFi people. And that was quite a journey for me because it was a lot of, explanation involved. Right. And I'm sitting there on my laptop in like a fucking Zoom call and I go like, I do have a couple of memes to explain this, but do I really show like the CIO of a big investment bank in Switzerland a meme now to explain how Bitcoin works? Probably not. So I need to create a deck for that going forward. But you're right. You should actually show that use case.
But I love the UBS meme where, 2018, the CEO of UBS says Bitcoin's going to zero. And then lo and behold, UBS goes bankrupt. That's absolutely one of my favorites.
And you know what the funny thing is? His nephew, I actually know his nephew, then also moved to Switzerland. He's a big Bitcoiner. So that was always funny when I read that in the media, that he's like the I fucking hate Bitcoin. And his nephew is basically like trying to orange pill, but he basically failed. Maybe if he should have listened, he would have still been CEO and Credit Suisse would still exist, but that's a different topic.
Right. It was Credit Suisse, not UBS. My bad.
Yeah, no worries. It was it's basically the same thing these days. So like, it doesn't really matter. But yeah, you're right. If you show that use case as the disinflationary asset, and thank you for using the right word because it drives me fucking nuts if I read another crypto media outlet article that claims it's deflationary and I go like, no, it's not. The last block has not yet been mined. We should actually go more into that. You're right.
And I hate when people go, well, but it is deflationary because we're never getting Satoshi's Bitcoin back and there's so many Bitcoin lost every day. I'm like, no, that's so misleading. Like, yeah, sure, there might be 3 million Bitcoin lost to the wind forever. But now you're just nitpicking because you were proven wrong,
Mm-hmm. There we go back with the whole debating and trying to be right all the time. Sort of mentality that should go away.
I've been married long enough to know that I'm just never right.
That proves that no one has girlfriends in Bitcoin. There we go.
Yeah. So for you, what have been like the biggest, I mean, obviously we've had the Bitcoin ETF, but what has been the maybe 2 or 3 things outside of the Bitcoin ETF that has you most excited about Bitcoin moving forward into 2025?
I think a lot of people will cringe now, but I'm thankful that stuff like Mt. Gox will soon be over. I mean, they had to extend another year, so that's a bit of a shame, but that's more down to the creditors and less to the trustee. And you had the stuff like the FTX blowups. Sure, they hurt in the short term, or the whole GBTC Ponzi trade, which led to the whole CeFi world going down. But that's good. We had to get this out early in the days and then move on. So we have less of these potential like big drop events and, you know, big news media events where people go like, oh, it's failed again and it's going to be dead. The halving didn't have that much of an impact yet, but I think we had the same in every halving. So let's see in a year from here on out. But to me, it's really besides these events not popping up in the future, so less potential danger to anything happening there. It really has been the ETF, and honestly, the interest into the whole launch of the ETFs, because you regularly read upon pension funds thinking about allocating. And this is not going to happen overnight, right? Like, I don't need to tell you, like a pension fund doesn't get up in the morning and go like, oh yeah, we all are into Bitcoin now because of all of the previous advantages we spoke about. But seeing the success and the reaction to that success and now slowly picking up that these things are happening. And then I'm also big interested in the whole mining aspect, just because I've always been fascinated by energy markets. And when I spoke to a few miners in Nashville and sort of energy companies, what they're planning in terms of utilizing stranded energy and building mobile mining hubs, if that makes sense, that makes me really bullish, because the more hash rate you can provide to the network, the more secure it will become in the end, and the more opportunities you will have to also fight the Elizabeth Warrens of the world that claim Bitcoin is wasting energy, although it isn't. So I think that next to these downside events and obviously the reaction to the ETFs is what makes me bullish into 25. And then we'll see what Jerome Powell does at the next meeting. If he's going to nuke everyone again, or if things are going to stay the same, you know?
I mean, we also have to see the outcome of the U.S. election. I think that's going to have a pretty profound impact on Bitcoin,
True.
Bitcoin's price, and frankly, the Bitcoin and crypto adoption throughout the United States. I mean, I was there in Nashville. I was sitting in the front row when Donald Trump announced that there was going to be a Bitcoin treasury, that he was going to create a strategic treasury reserve for Bitcoin for the United States if he's elected. Which obviously I think that would have a profound impact on Bitcoin's adoption, because if the US does take a policy like that, guess what other 150, 160, or I don't even know how many goddamn countries are on Earth, but guess how many other countries are going to follow? Just about every single one of them. I mean, it's great in everything that El Salvador and Bukele have adopted Bitcoin as a national currency. And I don't want to poo-poo on El Salvador and everything that he's been able to accomplish there. It's absolutely fascinating. And he's taking a bigger political risk than maybe anybody has in the last 20 or 30 years. I mean, the world's eyes are on him right now to see if this will work or if it won't. But it's tiny.
Yeah.
I don't want to say, like, this is where I say I don't want to poo-poo it or anything. I mean, have nothing but the absolute utmost respect for him. He's a trailblazer. He's a pioneer. He's running the government as if he's an entrepreneur, which is on one hand, a bit horrifying. On the other hand, absolutely fascinating because he's succeeding in doing it. But it's pennies on the global scale. Yep. Bhutan has recently started acquiring a whole bunch of Bitcoin, and they actually had a whole bunch of, Bitcoin maxis and Bitcoin community members that went and met with a whole bunch of their representatives. And they had an open-ended conversation around why Bhutan is now buying Bitcoin and using it in a strategic reserve capacity. Fascinating. All the credit in the world to them. They're one of the first 2 or 3 countries on Earth to do that. That is brave, that is courageous, and they deserve every accolade. But again, it's pennies.
Yep.
Which I'm not like poo-pooing on Bhutan either, but it's still pennies on the global scale. If Trump wins, and if the U.S. does take that policy and starts actively buying Bitcoin, for instance, you've also just seen recently the royal family of Qatar, the sovereign wealth funds of Qatar. There's now rumors that they might be buying up to $500 billion in Bitcoin. I don't know if that's true or not. I hope to God that it is. But that's going to be that as soon as the U.S. announces they're going to be doing this, every single country on Earth is going to have to come up with a policy to do the same. And I think that is inevitably what's going to happen in 2025, probably mid-25, should Donald Trump win the election.
Yeah, I mean, let me just look up what the other guy's name is. Am I actually allowed to share this publicly? So I did have an exchange with representatives of certain sovereign wealth funds for a couple of weeks now. because they all obviously also have subsidiaries in Europe, and they also have a lot of business in Europe. And it's quite interesting. Basically, their reasoning for getting in has exactly been what you'd said. We look towards the US. We basically don't give a shit what they do because we know, like, hey, if shit hits the fan, we're still good. But that reaction, just from that speech with Trump alone, and the whole thing within the, I would call it more libertarian, maybe Republican camp in Congress and in the Senate, where you see a lot of conviction for Bitcoin. The more they do this, the more pressure you actually build upon Asia, China specifically, the more pressure you also start building over in Europe, because there is a place in time in Europe where we will react, we just take a bit longer. And especially in like the Middle East. And if even half of the numbers they told me are true of what they plan to invest in the next 18 months, that's going to be quite staggering. And it could be sort of this power move shift from like the US over to the Middle East, or maybe a joint venture with them. That's quite bullish. Again, I just sat there and go like, well, it's easy to write that number on a piece of paper or in this form an email or say it in a call. But I think if the elections go the right way, we should see a very positive reaction. That's just then down to basically trusting, the suit in the US if they will allow the election. Let's call it this way. But yeah, that's also a power play. I'm curious, do you believe that Trump is really serious about the whole Bitcoin thing, or is it just a voter promise?
I think there's elements of seriousness, but I do think that Trump will do anything that he can to make money. Mm-hmm. I don't want to necessarily call him a con man, but he is a grifter in many capacities, right? I mean, Trump University before, that was an absolute grift, right? Like, let's be honest, even though I'm going to be voting for the guy, and I think that he will be an infinitely better president than Kamala Harris.
Oh, sure, yeah.
And I'm a one party, or not one party. Like I'm a one policy voter at this point. I'm going to go for the guy that is going to make sure that I don't go to jail just for owning Bitcoin, because I don't trust any goddamn thing Kamala is saying around crypto and her now being open to it. That's a lie. No. You had years in the Senate plus all this time to change, and you never did anything. So I think what really truly changed Trump's mind was Vivek Ramaswamy, who actually I voted for in the primary. I wanted him to become president. But I think Vivek got to Trump and convinced him that CBDCs are evil, which they are, and convinced him that there is value in having a forward-thinking crypto policy plus Bitcoin as a part of a strategic reserve. And I think Trump was convinced by that. But then I think Trump being who he is, Trump being Trump, then takes that a step further and starts thinking about ways that he can make money on it. So was it a way to get votes? Yes. Do I think that he believes in Bitcoin? Maybe not the same way you and I do, but he certainly sees its fundamental value. Is he a shitcoiner now? Well, yeah. I mean, as of this recording, he just launched that World Liberty DeFi something or other yesterday. I don't even know what the fuck that does. I don't even know if anybody knows what it does.
I think nobody does.
I literally don't think, I don't even think Donald Trump knows what World Liberty DeFi or whatever the hell it's called is. But hey, it's a way for Trump to bring in money. And I mean, the guy's been a good businessman for a couple of decades. He's been a grifter for a couple of decades in some capacities. So if this is just his latest grift, so be it, I guess.
One candidate grifts, another one likes to get on her knees a lot. So like, there you go. Everyone has his preferences. Let me know if you need to cut these things, because I'm just realizing, like, you're a public CEO. Maybe I shouldn't say everything that comes out into my head. But yeah, at the end of the day, I think it's, from a European standpoint, it's the lesser of two evils. I personally would also vote for Trump if I had the chance as an American. Right. Because if you do see the reactions to it, if you also look at it from an economical standpoint, whatever happened in the US the last 4 years now is absolutely miserable. And we've now basically got almost 100% proof that stuff like Operation Choke Point was really infiltrated by the current 100%. Administration. 100%. So if that's the way forward, that's going to be a hard play. But then again, if that would be the case, maybe that whole industry could then shift over to stuff like Asia, the Middle East, and you would have a different situation. But yeah, I think we'll agree if Orange Man gets in, it's good for Orange Coin.
I would agree entirely, and I think that is an absolutely perfect note to end on. Joel, thank you so much for joining us on the Proof of Words podcast. I think we're going to have a post-election podcast, and you and I can recap what we've seen in this election cycle and have a deeper dive into what we think whoever ends up winning the presidency will do for Bitcoin.
Sure, let's do it. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you for tuning in, everybody. I hope you all have a wonderful day.